You tricked me. It was you all the time.
Yes.
The encounter vanished into thin air the night it aired on the Twilight Zone in 1964. In an effort to put the show out of Americans' minds, the network banned it and put the tapes away. The main controversy, though, wasn't even that. For years, Rod Serling had been avoiding censorship by publishing fiction about extraterrestrials and time travel, which could have been the demise of his career. Now, thanks to the deleted sequences, we can see the true intentions of television's biggest rebel. Stories that mattered were what Rod Serling aimed to tell. His intended subjects were violence, racism, corruption, and avarice. Television in the 1950s, however, did not permit such candor. Censors removed content that would offend viewers, networks shied away from controversy, and sponsors had too much sway. Somebody would always get in Serling's way whenever he wrote anything daring. The system was too powerful for his attempts at resistance. Then, in an instant, everything changed. In 1955, in Mississippi, a black teenager called Emmett Till was assassinated. They took him from his bed, beat him, shot him, and threw him in a river after accusing him of whistling at a white woman. An all-white jury released his assailants notwithstanding their apprehension. The country was taken aback by the case. It was violent, unfair, and hard to turn a blind eye to. This narrative has to be told, Serling knew. Noon on Doomsday was the result of his screenplay writing. It was a mirror of Till's murder, a lynching in the South. His faith in television's power to expose the truth was dashed before the show even aired. Funding was threatened by advertisers. Racist organizations voiced their disapproval. The executives of the network were in a state of panic. They rearranged everything to stay out of trouble. The action now takes place in New England, rather in the South. After his murder, the man's race changed. But an anonymous outsider. It had become meaningless by the time it aired. Anger consumed Serling. The system had buried his attempt to communicate the truth. He knew then that he needed to try something new. He would encase his true tales in something grander if he couldn't convey them. Fantasy and science fiction were the correct responses. They were dismissed by the censors. Aliens and time travel stories may have appeared benign at first, but Serling sensed something more sinister was afoot. Without referring to actual conflicts, he could discuss war. He could demonstrate the perils of paranoia without really identifying his adversaries. He has the ability to reveal wrongdoing covertly. He could do it unimpeded. From this concept grew the Twilight Zone. Strange and unnerving adventures into the unknown awaited in every episode. A street where the terrified locals start fighting with one another. An astronaut who doubts Earth's existence ever existed. In this horrific universe, physical attractiveness is paramount. The tales were surreal, yet their messages were very obvious. By embracing his imagination, Serling was able to express his long-suppressed desires, and this time, no one could stop him. The very term, the Twilight Zone, was significant. For service members, it was the liminal zone between day and night, where perceptions of reality were hazy. That was precisely Serling's goal. In fictional universe that wasn't entirely made up either. A spot where readers might identify with the protagonists and villains and uncover the story's underlying meaning. Over the course of its 5 seasons, the Twilight Zone featured performances by some legendary performers. The stories, characters, and performances in each episode were different, and viewers remembered them all long after the final credits rolled. Having talented performers was not enough for the show's creator, Rod Serling. He was looking for actors who could pull off the offbeat and cerebral storylines that made the program famous. William Shatner was such a memorable visitor. 2 of his episodes went on to become classics. He portrayed a guy in Nick of Time who discovered a diner's fortune-telling machine. First impressions are that it's only a minor diversion. But his initial fascination quickly turns to dread as the machine's prophecies continue to materialize. Nightmare at 20,000 feet, his second visit, was an even more terrifying experience. The character he portrayed was a guy on the mend after a nervous breakdown in which he became paranoid that an alien was trying to hijack his jet. The episode became one of the most iconic in the history of the show due to his increasing terror. His terrified expression as he stared out the window of the jet is etched in my mind to this day. The Encounter, featuring George Takei, was a very contentious episode of the show. It was about a Japanese-American guy and a World War II veteran who were stranded in an attic during a storm. Their first uncomfortable talk delves into something far worse as time goes on. The past becomes insurmountable when secrets are exposed and passions flare up. Although the program was rarely rebroadcast following its first showing due to its dramatic nature, the impression that Takei's chilling performance made on viewers was substantial. Robert Redford portrayed a secretive and reserved soldier in Nothing in the Dark before he became a Hollywood celebrity. He pays a visit to a dying woman who has lived a life consumed by fear of dying. Believing that death would knock on her door one day, she stubbornly refuses to let anybody in. As he gradually gains her trust, Redford's character reveals that he is her worst nightmare come true. His kindness and warmth reassure her that death is not scary, unlike other villains. The episode stood out from the rest because to his performance, which added depth and passion. Burgess Meredith was one of the few actors who truly made an impression on the Twilight Zone. He was only in 4 episodes, but his performance in Time Enough at Last catapulted him to stardom. His character was a man who loves reading and manages to escape a nuclear holocaust. He is horrified to find himself alone among the world's wreckage, but he quickly comes to terms with the fact that he now has more time than he ever imagined to read. His spectacles plummet to the floor, breaking. There are books all throughout his room that he has lost interest in. He sits there in sorrow in the final frame, and it's still one of the most tragic TV scenes. The Twilight Zone was a stepping stone for future legends as well as current stars. Leonard Nimoy showcased the subtle intensity that would characterize his career in a number of episodes that aired a few years prior to Star Trek. Long before his filmmaking career in Happy Days, Ron Howard portrayed a small kid in Walking Distance, a touching film about a man's journey to the community where he grew up. Years before Easy Rider, Dennis Hopper delivered a terrifying performance in He's Alive, portraying a neo-Nazi on the brink of bankruptcy who was haunted by the specter of Adolf Hitler. Carol Burnett, on the other hand, added lightheartedness to a program that was otherwise recognized for its heavier subjects. She has the role of a troubled lady who is entrusted with the mission of finding a guardian angel in Cavender is Coming. Despite the episode's potential to kick off a comedic spin-off, it never materialized. But Burnett's performance showcased the charisma and timing of her comedy that would eventually bring her fame. Television was quite predictable when The Twilight Zone first in 1959. For the most part, shows stuck to a pattern, airing predictable tales in an effort to appease their advertisers. However, Rod Serling held a distinct opinion. He aspired to use television as a medium for storytelling that would provoke thought and question audience assumptions. He slipped social comments past the networks in unprecedented ways by encasing them in science fiction and fantasy, rather than providing plain messages. As a consequence, viewers witnessed a performance completely new to them. With 156 stories told across 5 seasons, The Twilight Zone was legendary. Making sure his vision remained intact, Serling wrote or co-wrote 92 of them. Paranormal happenings, haunted locations, and heroes struggling against insurmountable odds were commonplace in his tales. But there was always more going on behind the scenes of intrigue and mystery. Extraterrestrials, time travel, and the supernatural weren't the only topics covered. Real anxieties, including the unknown and authoritative figures, were the subject of these stories. Worry about being powerless. Even though it wasn't necessary, the show's ratings were below average. Many Emmys were bestowed upon it, including 2 for Serling's writing, and it garnered a devoted following. A trio of Hugo Awards attest to its influence on the science fiction genre. It altered the face of television, which is vital. It proved that television might serve a purpose beyond just amusement. It has the potential to cause individuals to doubt their surroundings. American Horror Story and Black Mirror were subsequent shows that used horror and science fiction to delve into contemporary fears. The capacity to convey stories that were simultaneously unbelievable and utterly familiar was what truly set The Twilight Zone apart. A normally peaceful neighborhood becomes a paranoid research subject in Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. It turns out that fear is sometimes the biggest adversary. All it takes is a power outage to set people against each other. This is the life. Observed a village run by a 6-year-old with supernatural abilities, illustrating the terrible nature of true power. The plot twists that ended each episode made the show renowned. Those weren't merely unexpected events. That was the lesson. A man who loves reading makes it through a nuclear holocaust in time enough at last. Tragically, his spectacles shatter right as he is prepared to savor his newfound leisure. It has a nasty turn of events, But it's not all down to poor luck. Isolation and the realization that material success isn't necessarily a guarantee of contentment are important themes. Many authors and filmmakers were impacted by this style of narrative. Similar plot twists were employed by films such as The Sixth Sense to alter viewers' perceptions of the tale. Black Mirror continued the trend of reflecting real-life anxieties via bizarre and disturbing settings. The Simpsons and Family Guy are only two examples of the many comedy that include references to the Twilight Zone, demonstrating how pervasive it is in popular culture. The show's enduring popularity belies its initial viewership. Through repeats, it was able to reach new generations of viewers who weren't even alive when it originally broadcast. A piece of television history was made of the creepy theme music, the disturbing narrative, and the unforgettable endings. The Twilight Zone's themes were not only important in the past, but they were ageless, as seen in the 2019 revival presented by Jordan Peele, which introduced the show to a new audience decades later. Unfortunately, things were far from perfect. An episode of The Twilight Zone that had been airing since May 1, 1964, has been missing for over half a century. Two men, a young Japanese American seeking employment and a resentful veteran of World War II, find themselves confined to an attic in this meeting. An innocent discussion escalates into a heated confrontation when a long-forgotten battle memento, a Japanese katana, begins to act strangely. A soldier he killed in combat is the one who gave it to the veteran, Fenton. As Fenton's animosity boils over, George Takei's Arthur Takamori listens on. After then, Takamori drops a bombshell. During the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, his father could have provided assistance to the Japanese forces. The show takes a somber turn at this point. Betraying the United States by Takamori's father is more than simply a plot twist. It reinforces an inaccurate and damaging stereotype. Fears of Japanese-American espionage were baseless, yet they led to the imprisonment of thousands of Americans throughout World War II. The Take family was only one of many that had their houses raided and punished as enemies. It was extremely insulting to imply that Takamori's dad was responsible for the crime that was used to establish the concentration camps. The reaction was swift. The program was removed from syndication by CBS and stayed that way for decades. The only time it made an appearance again was at a science fiction marathon in 2016. George Take had already achieved fame as an activist by that point, frequently bringing up the subject of his upbringing in an internment camp. The impact of narrative, for better or worse, was starkly illustrated by his performance in The Encounter. The episode's intended exploration of war guilt backfired, further solidifying Takei's life-altering views. The Twilight Zone was a vehicle for Rod Serling's frequent societal critiques. At least that much was evident on April 8, 1960, when The Big Tall Wish was shown. There was a subtle but revolutionary shift in television. The protagonist, Bully Jackson, was a bearded old fighter who had seen worse times. Henry, a little child, had such faith in him that he wished for something so powerful it might alter the course of history. Despite all the odds, Bully managed to win his fight. Everything fell apart, though, the moment he questioned the magic. He had been humiliated before, regretting their decision. It seemed like any other spooky story at first. Still, it accomplished something unusual for its era. Despite having a nearly all-black cast, the show avoided centering on race. Main parts for black performers were extremely unusual in the 60s, unless the tale dealt with overt racism. The topic of race was completely absent from this discussion. Everyone could identify to the characters since they were just regular individuals with hopes, fears, and problems. It was a daring move. It accomplished what television so frequently failed to do: it portrayed black folks as regular people. Opinions were divided. It was unsettling for some spectators to witness a black guy play a starring role. The episode was lauded by some for its innovative nature. Despite network reluctance, Serling continued to advance television, and then black gave him recognition for it. This trend persisted in subsequent series such as Star Trek and I Spy, demonstrating that diverse casts might become the rule rather than the exception. There was more to The Big Tall Wish than magic. It served as a gentle reminder that the most transformative narratives are those that portray characters in their authentic forms, and it was all about the subtle but powerful influence of representation. One of the most disturbing episodes of The Twilight Zone occurred on March 4, 1965. It all starts in a little town in I Am the Night, color me black where the sun never rises. The outer darkness is becoming increasingly dense as an execution of a guy approaches. The townsfolk's indifference causes the dark cloud to grow larger. Soon enough, what appears to be a local mystery turns out to be everything but. This isn't limited to a single town. Everywhere hatred is prevalent, the shadows are drawing near. It was hard to ignore the message. During this time, the civil rights struggle was in its midpoint. Streets were thronged with protesters. As a result, aggressive behavior ensued. Racism has molded the United States for generations, yet many Americans still refuse to face it. Their gaze was compelled to meet the Twilight Zones. It wasn't simply a weird occurrence, the darkness was becoming worse. It mirrored the way things really are. The impact was not cushioned by Serling. The experience was unfiltered, disturbing, and never-ending. That was the point, it made people feel awkward. No amount of dry facts or dry lecture could have reached its target audience as science fiction could. What happened in the last seconds affected everyone. The gloom would persist in encroaching. No amount of persuasion from those in power would make it stop. Next, there was an episode from season 5 about living dolls. Christy, a small girl, brings home a new toy at the beginning of the story. Talkie Tina is an imitating doll with the intention of becoming just like any other talking doll. However, an uneasy feeling arises immediately. Upon being picked up by Christy's stepfather Eric, the doll makes an inappropriate sound. Eric first takes it for a joke. Despite his best efforts, the doll keeps reappearing. After he discards it, it turns up again. He makes many unsuccessful attempts to break it. It becomes increasingly personal the more he resists. "Hi, I'm Talkie Tina, and I promise you'll regret this." With Eric's unraveling, the tension rises. Does the doll actually have life, or is he just hallucinating? This dude, Eric, isn't good. As the doll resists, his wrath at his wife and stepdaughter intensifies. He becomes increasingly desperate towards the end. He makes one final effort to destroy it. But as soon as he relaxes his grip, he tumbles down the steps. Death is discovered by his wife. He has the doll at his side. "You were outdone by me, Talkie Tina." The lack of an explanation for Talkie Tina's operation is what makes this episode so unsettling. How about a possession? Do you think it's karma? Both the details and the air of secrecy contribute to its horrifying and memorable nature. The doll was based on a modified briquette that was made to resemble the authentic Chatty Cathy dolls that were popular during that period. Chatty even more unsettling June Foray, who also provided the voice for Chatty Cathy, voiced Tina. Bernard Herrmann's score heightens the tension. A haunting melody played in the background, heightening the unease of each sight. Now fast forward to the 2020 remake of Small Town, and the source of the terror is completely different. A seemingly picture-perfect village is Jason Grant's new home. All the pieces in their proper places, tidy streets, kind neighbors. Except that I don't feel right. Nothing is ever questioned. The same people always are. The town appears to be immobilized. I am trapped. More nuance may have been achieved with the addition of a deleted scene. As he attempted to make sense of the peculiar regulations of the community, Jason spoke with a clergyman. The episode still gets its message across without it. Control and the price of perfection are at the heart of the matter. Despite its picturesque exterior, the town is actually constructed on a sinister foundation. Although everyone plays by the book, nobody truly has any freedom at all. It was common for the new Twilight Zone to update old themes. The little town is beautiful. One can't help but wonder what lengths individuals would go to in order to maintain peace and order. While living in a perfect world might be appealing, what if it meant never having to make a decision? Miniature from the 4th season follows. A tale that is disturbing but in a subtler sense. There is no one else like Charlie Parks. He is timid. Connecting is difficult for him. At a museum, he passes the time by gazing at a little house. But then an unusual event occurs. It seems as if the little people within are breathing. A lady plays the piano while he observes. Her body twitches in response. Her reaction is rather brief. It goes unnoticed by everybody. But Charlie insists it is genuine. He comes back day after day. This little, unfathomable realm captivates him. He quits showing up for work, quits interacting with others. Concern grows among his loved ones. Everyone around him thinks he's going crazy. An answer is never provided in the narrative. Could Charlie be hallucinating? Is he unique in his perception, though? The boundary between the real and the fantastic begins to dissolve. Charlie vanishes in the conclusion. The dollhouse is shown in the last image. A fresh face has emerged within. The woman playing the piano is accompanied by a male. Because of legal concerns, this episode was removed from syndication for a long time. Its significance became apparent upon its eventual return, though. In the conventional sense, it's not frightening. This is heartbreaking. If you've ever felt alone and isolated, this is for you. Is it really so different from finding happiness in reality if someone finds bliss in fantasy? It makes you question. Paul Douglas wasn't acting natural when filming Mighty Casey, an episode of The Twilight Zone. The majority of his co-workers assumed he had been drinking because of his ill appearance. It was easy to presume because of his drinking past, but that wasn't the truth. While he was on the job, he had a heart attack that nobody noticed. He died on September 11, 1959, only 2 days after filming Wrapped. The creator of the program, Rod Serling, was quite hurt. The original intent of the program was to create a comedic baseball show with some science fiction elements. However, Serling was unable to telecast the program in its original form due to the emotional toll of witnessing Douglas in his last days. Something wasn't quite right. It seemed completely out of place with the story's tone. Serling paid for the reshoots personally when CBS refused to. He shelled out $27,000 to reshoot every sequence with Douglas and hire actor Jack Warden. Since Alvin Ganzer, the original director, was unavailable, Robert Parrish was asked to oversee the additional material. Despite all, there was still a single shot of Douglas. Just one scene when McGarry, who plays him, is seen walking off into the distance. It was intentional on Serling's part. He wanted to pay tribute to the actor in a way that wouldn't bring unnecessary attention to the tragedy. Casey, a robot, becomes a brilliant pitcher for a baseball club that is suffering in the tale itself. He realizes baseball isn't for him after getting an artificial heart and starts feeling emotions. He decides he wants to be a social worker and quits playing the game. He leaves behind plans that might lead to the creation of even more robotic players, which raises the possibility that a fully robotic squad could eventually dominate the sport. Neither baseball nor robotics are crucial to the true narrative. The piece highlights Serling's commitment to his work and his admiration for those who helped bring it to life. When things were bad, he didn't simply abandon ship. Spending his own money to do it properly, he made sure the final result was something he could stand behind. In further episode, The Midnight Sun presented its own unique obstacle. For this occasion, it was a matter of survival, not tragedy. Earth has moved closer to the sun in the world where this episode takes place. The heat is too much. The seas are rapidly receding. This is a society in disarray. As the temperature inside their New York apartment continues to rise, two women, Norma and Mrs. Bronson, are attempting to stay alive. The authenticity of the heat was important to director Anton Leder. Special effects weren't his only tool. Everyone on set, including the performers and staff, had to feel the pain he was trying to convey. Set in the warmer months of 1961, there was no air conditioning in the studio. Leder ordered the electrical crew to crank up the heat on set, which only made matters worse. Just enough to throw everyone off their game, but not so much that it shows on film. The result was satisfactory. The perspiration was real. I wasn't faking my tiredness. The expressions of anguish on the faces of Norma and Mrs. Bronson were genuine. As the temperature rose, some individuals were on the verge of passing out from heatstroke. However, it was all worthwhile in the end. Stories written by Rod Serling have an uncanny knack for expressing provocative comments while evading censorship. There was more to The Twilight Zone than just bizarre happenings and terrifying turns. Real anxieties might be discussed in this way, while being silent on the subjects of racism, McCarthyism, and nuclear war. He risked having his career ended by the network if he had been more forthright. Instead, he came up with an alternate plan. The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, which ran in 1960, is a prime example of this. Set in a tranquil neighborhood, the narrative begins. Until an unusual power outage engulfs the whole town, everything is as usual. After that, mistrust sets in. Aliens, according to some, might be to blame. Even longtime neighbors are implicated when people begin to accuse one another. The street is in utter disarray by the finish. What about the twist? From a distance, the true aliens are observing. They may have caused the people's own destruction by sowing seeds of mistrust rather than by actually invading. It was a direct allegory for the paranoia-fueled Red Scare that pitted regular people against one another. Wrapping it in science fiction, Serling knew the network would never run a story explicitly on McCarthy. In this approach, the information was conveyed while maintaining an entertaining atmosphere. The Shelter, another 1961 episode, dealt with the nuclear hoax. As many Americans were doing at the time, it follows the narrative of a family that had constructed a fallout bunker. Their loved ones freak out whenever they get word that an attack is on the horizon. They grovel for admission. Desperation increases in tandem with the level of dread. When people stop caring about each other, violence ensues. Damage is done, although no real assault occurs at the moment. You won't hear anything about the conflict in this episode. That's the essence of humanity. When anxiety sets in, generosity fades. At a time when Cold War propaganda was trying to rally the country around a shared adversary, the story's audacity stood out. The adversary wasn't Serling's primary concern. In the event that things were awful, he wanted to know how Americans would treat one another. Because they were afraid the show may say anything too controversial, the network and advertisers were constantly monitoring it. Serling employed science fiction and fantasy to evade their grasp. It was once stated that such statements might be uttered by a Martian and yet be considered acceptable. He did it precisely. He could have avoided writing about an actual place if he had intended to address prejudice. In his image, I Am was born. He dared to challenge the audience's preconceived notions about war in works like The Night Color Me Black, in which a town is engulfed in perpetual night on the eve of an execution, and Quality of Mercy, in which a World War II American soldier finds himself unexpectedly inhabiting the body of a Japanese soldier. In an effort to gauge how much he could speak before being silenced, Serling was constantly testing limits. His groundbreaking work revolutionized television storytelling, demonstrating that unexpected twists may sometimes encapsulate the truth better than any other approach.